Hey there, ready to have your mind tickled?
Always up for a good mental workout.
Perfect. Because today we're diving into a topic that's truly mind-boggling. Consciousness.
The big C.
Exactly. What is it? Where does it come from? And could a robot ever have those me feelings?
So many questions, so little time.
Well, that's why we're here. And luckily, we have an excellent guide for this deep dive, David Papineau and his fascinating book, Thinking About Consciousness.
Definitely a must-read for anyone who's ever wondered about the nature of their own mind.
Get ready to explore your own mind in a way you never have before.
It's an incredible journey, and it really makes you question what sets us apart as humans, or at least what we believe sets us apart.
Exactly. So Papineau dives headfirst into this idea called materialism. Imagine baking a cake. You've got all these separate ingredients, right? Flour, sugar, eggs.
Don't forget the chocolate chips.
Of course, can't have a good cake without chocolate chips. But the point is, on their own, they're just ingredients. When you combine them in just the right way, following the recipe, you get something entirely new. A delicious cake.
And a happy stomach. But I see where you're going with this.
What's fascinating is that Papineau applies this same logic to consciousness. He's saying our consciousness, our thoughts, feelings, experiences, they're all a result of physical processes in the brain. Much like the cake is a result of the physical ingredients and the oven's heat.
It's a pretty wild idea when you think about it. Like, we're not talking about some mystical, ethereal soul here.
So instead of a soul separate from the body, it's more like our minds are the cake that emerges from the ingredients and recipe of the physical world.
Precisely. It challenges centuries of thought that put the mind on a pedestal separate from the material world.
It's a bold stance, for sure. But here's the thing. For most of us, it just feels like our minds are separate from our brains. Like there's this me inside looking out, separate from all those neurons firing away.
Oh, absolutely. It's such a common intuition.
Papineau calls this the intuition of distinctness. Why do we have this feeling if it's not necessarily true?
That's the million-dollar question. And Papineau digs into a few possible explanations. One is simply that we've been conditioned to think this way for centuries. It's ingrained in our language, our culture, our very understanding of what it means to be human.
It's like we're stuck in this old way of thinking, even if it's not the whole picture.
Exactly. But then Papineau presents his causal argument, and it's surprisingly straightforward yet powerful. Our conscious states, like decisions or emotions, have a very real impact on the world.
Give me an example, because sometimes these philosophical ideas get a bit too abstract.
Sure. Let's say you're feeling really thirsty, so you decide to get a glass of water. Your thought, I'm thirsty, is itself caused by physical processes, maybe dehydration, maybe your brain is sending out signals. That thought then leads to a physical action, getting up and getting a drink. It's a chain reaction.
Okay, so it's like each action, whether physical or mental, is a link in a chain, and that chain connects our mind and body.
Precisely. And that connection, that cause and effect relationship, is what Papineau points to as evidence that consciousness isn't this separate mystical entity, but rather deeply intertwined with the physical world.
That actually makes a lot of sense. But hold on. Some folks out there are probably thinking, wait, if it's that simple, what about all the other explanations? I mean, philosophers have been debating this for centuries.
You're absolutely right. And Papineau dives into some of those counter-arguments. One is called epiphenomenalism, which basically claims that consciousness doesn't actually do anything.
Hold on. So it's like saying that my decision to get that glass of water wasn't actually driven by my feeling of thirst.
You got it. It's like saying consciousness is just along for the ride, a shadow trailing behind our actions, but not actually influencing them.
So even though I felt thirsty and thought about water, that thought didn't cause me to get up. It was just there, like a passenger in a car who's not actually steering.
A great analogy. But Papineau argues this just doesn't hold up. We make choices and take actions based on our thoughts and feelings all the time. Think about it. Why would we even have thoughts and feelings if they didn't influence our actions in some way?
Right. That actually seems pretty obvious when you put it like that.
Exactly. Papineau argues this ability to act on our thoughts directly contradicts the idea of consciousness as a passive bystander.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about those who say, sure, maybe thoughts cause actions, but that still doesn't explain the feeling of consciousness? How do you explain what it's like to be conscious?
Ah, you've hit on a major criticism of materialism, often called the antipathetic fallacy. Critics argue that even if you could map out every neuron firing in my brain when I look at a sunset, you could never truly grasp what it feels like to be me experiencing that sunset.
It's like trying to explain the color blue to someone blind since birth.
Right.
You can describe it, but you can't convey the actual experience.
A perfect analogy. And this is where things get really interesting because Papineau agrees that subjective experience, that what its likeness, is incredibly complex. However, he argues that the problem isn't with the idea of materialism itself, but with how we tend to think about consciousness.
So he's saying our approach might be off, that we're coming to the table with the wrong mindset.
Precisely. We tend to imagine consciousness as this separate, almost mystical thing. So naturally, a purely material explanation feels incomplete.
So it's not that materialism is missing some vital piece of the puzzle. It's more that we might be trying to solve the wrong puzzle, so to speak. To really understand his point, we need to dive into this idea of phenomenal concepts. They're basically the mental tools we use to grasp those subjective experiences, like what it feels like to see blue or smell a rose. Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. Let's dive into those phenomenal concepts. Welcome back. We're about to unpack these phenomenal concepts, the mental tools we use to understand subjective experience.
It feels like this is a key part of Papineau's argument.
It absolutely is.
You see, Papineau argues that these phenomenal concepts, these ways we grasp subjective experience, are inherently kind of fuzzy. They're not as clear-cut as saying, this apple is red, because what it's like to see red is much harder to define.
It's like trying to explain what chocolate tastes like to someone who's never had it. You can describe its texture, color, even its chemical composition, but you can't fully convey the subjective experience of that taste.
Exactly. And that's what makes these phenomenal concepts so tricky. They're our way of grappling with something inherently difficult to pin down.
So it's not just that consciousness is mysterious. The very tools we use to think about it are a bit blurry around the edges too. Does that mean a materialist explanation of consciousness will always be lacking?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Papineau argues that the vagueness of our phenomenal concepts doesn't invalidate materialism. It just means we need to be more precise in how we use them.
So it's not that the tool itself is wrong, but we might be using it the wrong way.
Think of it like this. You wouldn't use a hammer to tighten a screw, right? You'd need a screwdriver for that. Similarly, we might need to refine our tools for understanding consciousness.
I like that. We need a different kind of tool, a more precise tool to really understand what's going on.
Exactly. It's about refining our understanding and accepting that some things might always remain a bit mysterious.
Okay, but if consciousness is material, does that mean we could, in theory, create a conscious machine?
No, that's a truly mind-blowing thought. Imagine a robot that not only processes information, but actually has its own internal experiences. Could we program consciousness into artificial intelligence?
It's like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
And Papineau doesn't shy away from this question. He argues that even if we built a machine that could perfectly mimic human behavior, even if it could pass the Turing test with flying colors, we still might never truly know if it's genuinely conscious.
Wait, why not? If it walks like a duck and talks like a duck.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Papineau proposes that consciousness might be something that emerges specifically from biological systems. Think of it like this. Water molecules by themselves aren't wet, but their interaction creates the emergent property of wetness.
So you're saying consciousness might be an emergent property of the way our brains, as evolved organs, interact with the world, and simply replicating the process in a machine might not be enough.
Exactly. It might not just be about replicating the processes of the brain, but also the very substance of the brain itself. It's a complex issue that forces us to rethink the very definition of consciousness.
This is making my brain hurt in the best way possible. But we're not done, are we? Because if consciousness is material, what happens to concepts like free will and morality? If it's all just neurons firing, does that mean we're not really in control?
Those are questions that have puzzled philosophers for ages. And Papineau doesn't pretend to have all the answers, but he argues that a materialist view of consciousness doesn't automatically negate free will or responsibility.
So even if my brain is calling the shots, there's still room for me to be held accountable for my actions. How does that work?
He dives into the idea that even if our choices are ultimately a product of physical processes, those processes are incredibly complex. They're influenced by a lifetime of experiences, memories, values, everything that makes you, you.
It's like Sure, my brain might be wired a certain way, but that wiring has been shaped by my environment, my upbringing, everything I've experienced.
Exactly. And within that intricate web of influences, there's still space for agency, for you to make choices and be held responsible for them.
Okay, that's reassuring, I have to admit. But there's still this feeling of an explanatory gap, right? That no matter how well we map the brain, there will always be this gap between the physical and what it feels like to be conscious. How does Papineau address this?
The explanatory gap. It's a challenge that Papineau tackles head-on. He doesn't dismiss it, but he suggests that maybe, just maybe, it's not as insurmountable as we tend to think.
So is he saying there's a way to completely bridge the gap, to perfectly explain subjective experience in material terms? Or we're talking about reframing how we view the gap itself?
That's the beauty of Papineau's work. He leaves us with more questions than definitive answers, but they're the kind of questions that make you want to keep thinking, keep exploring, keep diving deeper into the mysteries of consciousness.
Speaking of diving deeper, let's take a quick break. When we come back, we'll explore more of Papineau's insights and what they mean for our understanding of the mind and the world around us. Don't go anywhere. And we're back.
Still diving into the mysteries of consciousness.
You got it. We've been on quite a journey with David Papineau and his book, Thinking About Consciousness, exploring this idea that consciousness is, at its core, material.
It's amazing how deeply ingrained the opposite view is, right?
Totally. We're so used to thinking about the mind as separate from the body.
But Papineau presents some pretty compelling arguments for why we should reconsider that. Like, remember that whole thing about phenomenal concepts?
You mean those fuzzy mental tools we use to grasp subjective experiences?
Exactly. And how those concepts themselves might be part of the reason we struggle to connect consciousness to the physical world.
It's like we're trying to describe a sunset using only words for colors, without any way to convey the feeling of warmth on your skin or the awe you experience when you see those vibrant hues.
A perfect analogy. And Papineau suggests that refining those concepts, making our language more precise, could be key to bridging that explanatory gap we've been grappling with.
So instead of hitting a wall, maybe we just need a better ladder to climb over it.
Precisely. And who knows what incredible new insights await us on the other side.
That's what makes this whole exploration so exciting. We're challenging centuries of philosophical thought and pushing the boundaries of what we know about ourselves and the universe. It's humbling, really.
Absolutely. And it's a reminder that we're always learning, always evolving in our understanding.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it feels less like we've reached a destination and more like we've just begun an incredible journey.
Exactly. And like any good journey, it's less about the destination and more about the exploration, the questioning, the constant search for a deeper understanding.
So to everyone listening, keep those minds open, keep questioning, and keep exploring. Until next time.